The parties in the GNU are in an all-out battle over the foreign policy of the country. This comes after the US action in Venezuela. Here's what's happening. So the GNU partners have been at odds with each other intensely in recent times, particularly regarding foreign policy issues, and now is no different. You see, after the US captured Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela, pretty much all the major political parties in South Africa had something to say. And what was most notable about this is the fact that the main partners of the GNU are at each other's throats yet again, this time seemingly more intensely than was the case before. So before we get into this and all of the reactions from the main partners, I'd like to remind you all to please subscribe to the channel. It's entirely free and all you have to do is click on the subscribe button below. If you would like to enjoy some additional perks, consider becoming a Power Club member. All you have to do is click on the join button below this video. Now let's get into it. So DIRCO, South Africa's foreign policy department, issued a very strong condemnation of the US action. However, it is known that DIRCO is controlled solely by the ANC. Still, this didn't stop the party from releasing a press release internally of its own. So as explained here, the ANC condemns US imperialist aggression against the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. It's amazing how the ANC loves to use their buzzwords. If it's not racism, if it's not apartheid, it's imperialism. So going on, we see the ANC condemns the recent acts of aggression directed at Venezuela, which constitutes a serious violation of international law, national sovereignty, and the principles governing peaceful relations between states. It's interesting to hear them talk about violations of international law, but what I'd actually like to ask the ANC is, what laws are you actually talking about? Please can you list for me what international laws, so to speak, have been broken? Because every single time you release a statement, you talk about how it violates international law, yet you don't actually explain what law it's violating. So please, for the first time in your lives, give us the details. Moving on, it explains that the kidnapping of Comrade, I love how they call him Comrade, President Nicolas Maduro, his wife Comrade, again, Cecilia Flores, and son Nicolas Ernesto Maduro, who apparently isn't a comrade, undermines the United Nations Charter and threatens global peace and stability at a time when the world requires cooperation, restraint, and dialogue. So, in addition to expressing its solidarity, the ANC makes a pretty interesting call further down, and it explains here. The ANC further calls on peace-loving people in our country, across the continent, and around the world, including within the United States, to call for the immediate and unconditional release of President Maduro. The world must reject all actions that undermine democracy, international law, and human dignity. The devastating humanitarian consequences of war, sanctions, and economic coercion must remain central to the conscience of the global community. Now, of course, economic coercion is not something that the ANC can really speak on, particularly since DIRCO decided to not only condemn the United States, but call for a UN Security Council meeting on the matter. And so, in the most explicit terms, the ANC has made the United States into enemy number one, at least for the party. The DA, however, had a little bit more of a nuanced approach to the situation. In their own press release on their website, the DA decided to slam DIRCO, or the ANC rather, for what it calls diplomatic hypocrisy. And here's what they explained. So DIRCO's appeal to the UN Security Council to urgently convene to discuss the capture and prosecution of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro by the US smacks of hypocrisy and contradiction, as DIRCO failed to take a similar stance on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. This exposes the politically selective and hypocritical means in which the ANC conducts South Africa's diplomatic relations on the international stage. And so this is interesting because right here we see how the DA has indirectly suggested that DIRCO is indeed the ANC and that other parties in the GNU really don't have a say on foreign relations. Furthermore, it is actually a pretty relevant point. Now, going further down, we see that the DA does not actually speak about the US-Venezuela issue directly. And we know that the DA is pretty risk averse. They don't want to appear controversial, so they've avoided either supporting or condemning the US. Still, they make a very interesting point, and a valid point at that, which is that the ANC seems to be serving its own self-interests, and this contradictory kind of action proves it. We've seen how they've gravitated towards the global south while rejecting the West, and this is very clear in their response. But another party really seems to have taken a very supportive stance towards the US action. The party I'm speaking about is the Freedom Front Plus. And here, in a press release, they explained the ANC cannot speak on behalf of South Africa regarding Venezuela. So as is written here, the ANC cannot speak on behalf of South Africa regarding the events in Venezuela or its foreign policy. The FF Plus has repeatedly pointed out that the ANC's ideologically driven anti-Western policy does not reflect the sentiments of all South Africans. The Freedom Front Plus welcomes the actions of the United States against the illegitimate regime of Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. The free world is under a moral obligation to act against countries with autocratic governments where human rights are trampled and criminality cannot be separated from policy. And so this is a very strong stance from the Freedom Front Plus. And on the other end of the aisle, we see how another GNU partner has taken the extreme opposite response. So here we see an ex-post from Songezo Zibi, who is the head of Zansi, which is a small party, albeit a member of the GNU. And he stated, US action in Venezuela is criminal and has echoes of 1930s Europe as Hitler went on a rampage and plunged the world into World War II. There's absolutely no justification for this action. It's unlawful in international and US domestic law. Again, I ask you, you keep talking about how things are unlawful, but point to which laws it's actually violating. You know, if you can point to those laws, fine, we can accept it. But it just amazes me how these political parties in all their press releases talk about violations of law, yet they never provide details and actually evidence of their accusations. And for whatever reason, people just seem to take it as is, take it at face value and say, okay. Furthermore, comparing the US to Hitler is a really distasteful thing and quite unacceptable thing to do. And it really is an insult to the people who survived World War II and the Holocaust, as well as those who, of course, perished and their families. So, yes, a very distasteful post from Zibi. Still, there were other members of the GNU who produced, let's call it, a more nuanced approach. So the Patriotic Alliance didn't actually release any sort of press statement on their website. However, they did speak to the Daily Maverick, specifically the Patriotic Alliance spokesman, Steve Mortale. So Mortale said the US action in Venezuela was an example of power making its own rules. We hear so many people talking about how Maduro was mistreated as a head of state, but it's also quite overwhelmingly clear that his re-election as president for a third term was highly questionable. And here he's referring to the election results having been rigged, which many NGOs and external government organizations seem to have found to be the case. The US isn't applying the same standards to all countries, of course, and it never has. It also never will, because this was simply a geopolitical power play from the world's most powerful military to strengthen its economic interests, particularly as Venezuela has the world's greatest oil reserves. Mortale said the party was watching the installation of Venezuelan Vice President Delcy Rodriguez as acting president with interest, and had noted that the country's constitutional mandate for a new election within 30 days was being ignored. So a very interesting response from the Patriotic Alliance, and yet again, they actually show how they are a party that really understands power very well. We've seen how well they understand power in their electioneering and governance in the local South African political landscape, but we've also seen how they have this understanding when it comes to international geopolitics. And so it's a very nuanced approach. On one hand, they refused to straight up condemn the US, but they did acknowledge that this was a power play. On the other hand, however, they acknowledged that Maduro's reign is problematic and that he most likely was not democratically elected for a third term. And so this is probably, as I explained, the most nuanced approach from any political party within the GNU. But of course, this once again shows how the GNU is exceptionally fractured. The DA, Freedom Front Plus, and even to an extent the Patriotic Alliance have taken issue to a large extent with the ANC's foreign policy, whereas smaller parties like Zansi really seem to be ANC puppets in many regards. Furthermore, we've also seen how, regardless of these scuffles, the ANC just seems to brush its partners aside and do whatever it wants, advancing its own internal agenda. It really, in many respects, feels as if the ANC still thinks that it is the majority party with over 50% support, and is acting as such. To date, even with the clearinghouse mechanism within the GNU being implemented, we really don't see any material changes on the ground, and it will be interesting to see if and when any GNU partners may be able to change this unilateral course of action by the ANC, because in recent times it really doesn't seem to be the case. Still, this sort of behavior could have election repercussions. And with the local elections coming up later this year or early 2027, it will certainly be interesting to watch. Thank you very much for tuning into this video. If you enjoyed it, please remember to subscribe to the channel for more content. Until next time, I'm Matthew Cohen, and this is the Power Pod.